Good day, third year English literature students. Today we are going to start with a new poem in memory of W. Yeats. This poem is written by W. H. Auden and it is in the form of an elegy. You must have already done an elegy when you were in second year, elegy written in a country churchyard. So you already know what is an elegy. Elegy is a sad poem generally written on the death of some person. Now, this is an elegy written in the memory of W.B. Yeats and it was written shortly after the death of Yeats in 1939 and it was a time which was fraught with uncertainty as the world was on the brink of another world war. And it was at this time that Auden also moved to America. This poem is in the nature of an obituary. Obituary means written after someone's death, and it is both an evaluation and an elegy. It is also a prayer. Now, let us start with this poem, and the title of the poem is In Memory of W.B. Yeats. First, I will read the first stanza, then explain the meaning to you. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted. The snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. Oh, all the instruments agree the day of his death was a dark, cold day. Now, W. H. Auden is describing the sad day when W.B. Yeats passed away. So, he is describing the grayness of the day, the grimness of the day. Now, notice the objective correlative in this stanza. Whatever is going on in the mind of the poet, he can correlate it with the objects of nature. He says, he disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen. He means W.B. Yeats. Disappeared, he died in the dead of winter. Means when winters were coldest in January. The brooks were frozen. Now he is describing the atmosphere around. All the small rivers, the brooks, were so cold that they were frozen. Airports almost deserted. Now the airports did not have much rush, much crowd because of the cold weather, because of the chilly weather. The snow disfigured the public statues. There was so much of snowfall that you couldn't even recognize the public statues placed on the crossroads. So, with the heavy snowfall, the public statues were disfigured. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. Beautiful image. Now, mercury. What do you do by mercury? In a thermometer, we have mercury in order to take temperature. If the mercury rises, means the temperature of your body is high. And if the mercury sinks, the temperature of your body is low. So, here we have to imagine that the day is dying. Day is dying means it is evening time. It is about to be night very soon. And the mercury in the mouth of the day is sinking, means the temperature of the falling day, of the dying day, is coming down. So it is a very beautiful image, because if you put a thermometer in the mouth of a dying person, it will sink, the mercury will sink. So he says that it was a cold dying day, means it was the time of evening and The day was dying and it was very cold. Oh, all the instruments agree the day of his death was a dark, cold day. So he associates the darkness, the coldness of the atmosphere of that day with the darkness and coldness of WBH's death. He says that the day of his death was dark and cold. It was really very cold. All the rivers were frozen. The airports did not have much rush. They were almost deserted, and the public statues were disfigured by the heavy snowfall, and the mercury in the mouth of the day was continuously falling. And he says all the instruments agree, all these things agree that the day of the death of WBH was a dark, cold day. Far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forests. The peasant river was untempted by the fashionable quays. By moaning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. Now he says, this event of the death of W.B. Yeats did not have any effect on nature. Nature was indifferent, far from his illness. Now, W.B. Yeats was hospitalized in a city, and away from that city, away from that hospital, in the jungle or in the countryside, what was happening? The wolves ran through the evergreen forest. Nature was indifferent. There was no reaction by the nature. The peasant river was untempted by the fashionable quays. Now, he is indirectly referring to W.B. Yeats that he was a peasant river. He was so very natural that he was untempted by the fashionable quays of cities. His poetry, by moaning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. Now, it was the death of the poet, it was not the death of his poems. His poems still lived on, even after the death of his physique. But for him, it was his last afternoon as himself. He says that though he is still alive as a poet, but as a person, it was his last afternoon. An afternoon of nurses and rumours. The provinces of his body revolted, the squares of his mind were empty, silence invaded the suburbs, the current of his feeling failed, he became his admirers. Now, here we have the diction of kingdoms and the diction of places. He says, though his poems are still alive, but it was his last afternoon. He says, an afternoon of nurses and rumours. It was the last day of his life, and that day was filled with nurses in the hospital who was taking care of the dying poet W.B. Yeats, and it was also the day of rumors because there were so many people crowded outside the hospital, and every now and then there was a rumor that W.B. Yeats is dead, or W.B. Yeats is about to die, or he is recovering. So there were a lot of rumors. The provinces of his body revolted. Now you have to pay attention to the words. See, provinces, squares, suburbs. So the current of his body was failing. He compares the body parts of W.B. Yeats to provinces. He says that the provinces of his body revolted. What happens to a kingdom when its provinces revolt? The kingdom has a downfall. So the kingdom of his body was having a downfall or was dying down, coming to an end because the provinces of his body revolted. It means that what are the provinces of your body? Heart, lungs, liver, kidneys. So one by one they were all failing. The squares of his mind were empty. Squares of his mind were empty means those places of his mind. Square is known to be a very crowded place. So here his mind is being compared to a crowded place because his mind has always been crowded with new ideas, with new feelings, always new ideas in order to create new poems. But today the squares of his mind were empty, means his mind is also failing. So his mind is not able to think anything. His mind is not able to create any poem. Silence invaded the suburbs. Now, suburbs are the busy places of any city, but generally, what is the nature of a suburb? It is a very crowded place, it is a very noisy place. But today, the suburb means the limbs of W.B. Yeats, the limbs are failing. So there is no activity in his body parts, there is no activity in his mind, there is no emotion in his heart. So silence has invaded the suburbs. The current of his feeling failed, and at last what happened? That all his body parts they failed, and the current of his body went away, and he closed his eyes. He became his admirers. Beautiful words. Now, W.B. Yeats did not live in his body, but he lived in his admirers. So he became his admirers. Next stanza. Now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections, to find his happiness in another kind of wood, and to be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. Now the poet says that now he is scattered among 100 cities. Now imagine that when a great person dies, his ashes are scattered over a lot of cities. But here this expression means that the thoughts, the feelings, the preachings of this poet W.B. Yeats is scattered among a lot of cities by the way of his poems. Now he says, a lot of people know about W.B. Yeats, not personally though, but they know him through his poems. So he says that he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections. Now, his poems are also read in foreign lands, and his poems may be understood and they may be misunderstood. Now, he is not there to give an explanation or to save himself. So, wholly given over to unfamiliar affections, to find his happiness in another kind of wood, and to be punished under a foreign code of conscience. Now, W.B. Yeats was associated with the Irish movement. So, here W H Auden is saying that because he was deeply engrossed in the Irish movement, so he tried to find his happiness in another kind of wood, means another country, and he was punished under another foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified by the guts of living. Now, when the poet dies, his poems, when they are read after the death of the author, as I told you that they may be interpreted in a healthy manner or they may be interpreted in a very wrong manner. They may be misinterpreted because the poet does not live to give an explanation. But in the importance and the noise of tomorrow, when the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floor of the boughs, and the poor have the suffering to which they are fairly accustomed, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom, a few thousand will think of this day as one think of a day when one did something slightly unusual. Oh, all the instruments agree the day of his death was a dark, cold day. The poet says that though he has died, but his poems live on, but he is not there, he is not present to give an explanation, to explain the meaning of his poem, because now his poems may be misinterpreted too. And he says that the world is still going on as usual. Nobody or not, there are not much people who miss the poet, the great poet. He says, still people will remember this particular day, his death anniversary, as when one remembers a day when something unusual happened. So he says that after some time, when on the stock exchange, people are roaring like animals, and the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed. Now he is now talking of the Irish people. He says that the poet gave his life, his youth, his energy to the Irish movement, but still the poor are suffering and they are fairly accustomed to their sufferings. And each in his cell is each person in his limited periphery is convinced of his freedom. A few thousand in such a large population, only a few thousand will miss this poet, will think of this day, and even they will think of this day as one did something slightly different, slightly unusual. Now he says, oh, all the instruments agree that the day of his death was a dark, cold day. Now again he repeats these lines, and this is called a refrain. When you repeat the whole line or whole words, it is called a refrain. So we will continue in our next lesson. Thank you.